Welcome back to this final session of today's conference on the self. Our final speaker is Ralph Weir, co-founder and organizer of the Humane Philosophy Project. He's currently at Jesus College, Cambridge, but he also teaches at Blackfriars, Oxford, and at Buckingham University, and he's also a fellow of the Dalai Lama Centre here at Oxford, and his interests include the self. What else are you interested in?
It's the only one. Thank God for conferences on the right thing.
You're also interested in experience and values, and particularly in the experience of values, as well as Plato and ancient philosophy. So,
well remembered.
None of these themes will appear in the talk that we're going to hear Ralph deliver today, which is going to be why property dualists should be Cartesians. So please give a very warm welcome to Ralph.
Thank you, and I know I've got the unenviable last spot, so I'll try to gallop through this towards the wine which shines on the horizon. So, dualism is the thesis that in addition to physical entities, there exist non-physical mental entities whose existence is something over and above the existence of the physical entities. These mental entities are, to quote David Chalmers, something fundamentally new in the world. Now, according to the received view of the two kinds of dualism that have been endorsed, substance dualism and property dualism, substance dualism is beyond the pale and has been for many years now, whereas property dualism remains a respectable position deserving of our attention and interest. In this paper, I'm going to argue that the standard grounds for accepting property dualism force us to accept classical substance dualism like Descartes as well. When I say the standard grounds, well, I'll come to this. The idea is that if you are going to endorse the arguments for property dualism, then your rational commitments probably commit you to substance dualism as well. So I'll begin by clarifying the distinction between property dualism and substance dualism. Substance dualism is standardly introduced by the example of Descartes, as you all know, and there he is. So for Descartes, a substance is something that has independent existence, and that means something that can exist without anything else, or without anything else leaving aside God. And according to Descartes, there are two kinds of substance, mental and physical, and mental substances are subjects or selves, the I of the cogito, amongst other things. Physical substances, on the other hand, are exhausted by space and matter, between which Descartes draws no distinction. This view, substance dualism, can be contrasted with property dualism. And property dualism is the position defended in a few important works. Best known are Frank Jackson's 1982 essay, Epiphenomenal Qualia, David Chalmers' 1996 book, The Conscious Mind, and Taegwon Kim's 2005 book, Physicalism or Something Near Enough. According to these works, there do exist fundamentally new mental entities over and above the physical entities, but these aren't substantial selves, they're only phenomenal properties or experiential properties. The latter two works, David Chalmers and Taegwon Kim, take pains to make it clear that their position is not substance dualism like Descartes, but merely property dualism, and they see this as an important advantage of it. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that, well, it might seem natural to suppose that substance dualism would just be the view that there are non-physical substances in addition to physical things, and that property dualism is just the view that there are non-physical properties in addition to physical things, but not substances. Although that's a very neat way of drawing the distinction, it fails to capture a very important division which exists in the literature, and this is that substance dualists, or paradigmatic substance dualists, always say that the non-physical entities are selves or subjects, whereas property dualists, or paradigmatic property dualists, always say that the non-physical entities are experiences or qualia, right? So there's two differences between the paradigm positions. One is that there's substances on one hand and properties on the other. The other is that there are selves or subjects on the one hand and only non-physical experiences on the other. One way of illustrating this is to say that a follower of Hume or the Buddhist thinker Nagarjuna, if I've pronounced that correctly, the chances are pretty slim, thinkers who purportedly deny the existence of the self, they could still hold that there were non-physical substances, but that these substances are just experiences, or qualia. Now, there'd be a sense in which they were substance dualists, but in an important respect, they'd be much closer to a paradigmatic property dualist because they wouldn't be positing non-physical selves. They'd be something in between the positions we actually see usually in the literature. So, there are lots of ways of defining substance. And sometimes people write as though we're just free to pick our favorite when we're defining substance dualism. Now, I think that creates a lot of misleading equivocation. And this is because by substance dualism, we're usually meant to mean the position endorsed by Descartes. And when metaphysicians eschew substance dualism, it's Descartes from whom they always say they're trying to distance themselves. So it seems obvious to me that when we're defining substance dualism, if we're not going to have a muddled debate, we ought to use the notion of substance Descartes is using. Therefore, when I talk about substances, I mean something with independent existence, or something that could exist without anything else, leaving aside perhaps God if you're Descartes, and perhaps things like necessary abstracta like numbers if those exist. Now, by properties, we usually mean something that characterizes a substance or an entity or an object or a particular. And we mean especially the kind of characteristics that things can share, like colors, sizes, and shapes. There are a few main theories of properties. There's the universals theory, the resemblance classes theory, and the trope theory. For present purposes, I don't think it matters which theory of properties we have in play. However, it is worth pointing out that we can use the word property in two ways on some of these theories at least. So we can talk about the property instance, as it were, the particular blackness of this chair. And we can also talk about the universal blackness of which it is an instance, or the resemblance class of black things of which it is a member. Now, the only claim I want to make here is that property dualism is a thesis about property instances, so understood. So if you're a Platonist and you think that the universal experience is a non-physical entity because it's floating in the Platonic heaven, that doesn't make you a substance or a property dualist. Property dualist is the relevant one. That doesn't make you a mind-body dualist so long as all the instances of experience are physical. Now, the purpose of this paper is to argue that if we're going to be dualists at all, we should be substance dualists like Descartes. So we should endorse not only non-physical phenomenal properties, but substantial non-physical selves. Now, I think this is a matter of immense importance. This is partly because the self seems to be the locus of many of the things we think are of most significance. So free will, moral responsibility, moral worth, personal survival, personal identity, and so forth. And I think that if we try to get the self on the cheap, ontologically speaking, we should be in danger of jettisoning these things from our worldview, a tendency which is at once dangerous and dreary. Now, the claim that property dualism leads to substance dualism, or that the commitments of property dualists should commit them to substance dualism, has been made by a few thinkers before. And I have in mind here two papers in particular by Susan Schneider in 2012 and Dean Zimmerman in 2010. I don't have time to go into their discussions, but I will say why I think my arguments are more interesting. This is a fair fight. The central reason for this is that it seems to me, because you might want to look these things up. The central reason I think my argument's more interesting is that Schneider's arguments, in my view, if they work, show us that property dualists need non-physical substances, but they don't go any way towards showing us that property dualists need non-physical selves, or that those non-physical selves will be substances. And the other way around, Zimmermann's arguments, it seems to me, if they work, show us that property dualists need non-physical selves, but they don't go any distance to showing that those selves would have to be Cartesian or any other kind of substances. And so neither of these papers or lines of argument get from property dualism to paradigmatic substance dualism, where we have substantial non-physical selves that float above the bed, as in the William Blake painting I had on the first slide. So they don't really do that. And of course, it's quite difficult choosing paintings of the soul or of non-physical selves, because it always looks more corporeal than it should. It's a difficulty making a PowerPoint for this kind of talk. So the strategy that I'm going to employ for making this argument is to adopt lines of reasoning closely parallel to what we might call the standard argument for property dualism. And the thought here is that if my arguments are extremely close in structure, in logical structure, and extremely close in their intuitive backing, or that of the premises, to those of the argument for property dualism, then anyone who accepts the latter ought to be under rational pressure to accept the former. So here's what I take to be the something like the standard argument for property dualism. I've made it a bit more simple because we only have so much time, but it goes like this. The physical facts about our world do not a priori entail the existence of consciousness. That is to say, you could know everything there is to know about the physical world, or the actual physical world, and have the concept of conscious beings, but you wouldn't be able to work out that there are conscious beings. You wouldn't be able to infer it from the physical facts alone. Or it's to say that we can imagine a world that was a physical duplicate of our world, but where no one was conscious. Okay? This has been argued by many people in different ways. The physical facts about our world don't a priori entail the existence of consciousness. They might a posteriori give us evidence for it. That's a different question. Number two, if this is the case, then the physical facts do not metaphysically necessitate the existence of consciousness. Premise 2 takes us from this epistemic idea in premise 1 about a priori entailment to a metaphysical claim about what necessitates what. And the conclusion, consciousness is something over and above physical entities. Now, the point of this argument is it takes us from this epistemic idea, the physical facts don't a priori entail the existence of consciousness, to the idea that you could have the physical facts holding without consciousness, or that consciousness is something extra or beyond. Now, despite their differences in detail, classics such as the zombie argument or the Mary argument for property dualism share something like this structure. This has been argued by David Chalmers in his 2010 book, and I think that anyone who accepts these classic arguments is probably going to have to accept the standard arguments as well. So getting metaphysical conclusions from the absence of a priori entailment is very controversial, but I'm just going to assume with property dualists that we can do it, because they're my target in this talk. And if we can do this, it's a very powerful tool for making precise metaphysical arguments. So here's an example. Before I move on to my own, Stephen Priest has argued that the fact that you are you can't be accommodated by a physicalist view of the world. And he said something to this effect this morning. Now, one way we could give a precise formulation of Priest's argument would be in terms of a priori entailment. So, the physical facts about our world, we might say, do not a priori entail your existence. If the physical facts do not entail your existence, then they do not metaphysically necessitate your existence. Therefore, you are something over and above physical entities. Now, there's a few other ways you could do it. One of the interesting things about this argument is that on page 85 of his classic work, The Conscious Mind, where he's more or less arguing for property dualism, David Chalmers endorses roughly that argument, or he endorses a line of reasoning that looks like it could be understood as that argument. However, he quickly puts it to one side and moves on. Now, I'm going to move on to my own line of reasoning, and this has two stages. I call these the Barclayan argument and the Solipsistic argument. I should just say, both of these are going to make metaphysical inferences from the absence of a priori entailment, just as is done in this argument and in the standard argument for property dualism. If you don't think that that's a legitimate move, then you can still agree with me that those who do think it's a legitimate move ought to accept these arguments on the same grounds that they accept the arguments for property dualism. And this is still interesting because I think it shows the features of our epistemic situation which have made classical substance dualism such an enduring thesis despite the best efforts of philosophers to suppress it over the last several hundred years. So, there we go. Barclayan argument and solipsistic argument. I have a picture of Barclay there because he's a Barclayan, one of them. And I have a picture of the early Wittgenstein there because the early Wittgenstein appears to be a solipsist. And this, funnily enough, came up in our discussion earlier. So the Barclayan argument and the solipsistic argument have different jobs. The job of the Barclayan argument is to get from property dualism to a sort of non-classical kind of substance dualism where there are non-physical substances that aren't selves, and then the solipsistic argument will finish the job and get us to non-physical substantial selves. I knew I'd missed a page, but almost missed a page. So, as I've said, the notion of substance that I'm using here is the Cartesian one. Substances have independent existence. And one way to understand this, leaving aside necessary entities, should there be any, is to say that X is a substance if and only if there is a possible world that contains only X. And some people have said that this old notion of substance has no role to play in contemporary metaphysics. Now, I say this is incorrect, because it can easily be shown that every contemporary metaphysician is committed to the existence of at least one Cartesian substance. And I have in mind here the aggregate of all entities that exist in the actual world. Trivially, the aggregate of all actual entities is a Cartesian substance because there's a possible world, this one, in which only that thing exists. Now, property dualists are obviously committed to one further Cartesian substance. For according to the standard argument for property dualism, the actual physical entities do not metaphysically necessitate the existence of consciousness. And to say that they don't necessitate it is to say they could exist without it. So property dualists are committed to the view that there's a possible world where all the actual physical entities exist, but consciousness doesn't. Hence, for a property dualist, the aggregate of actual physical entities is a substance, a Cartesian substance, a bit like Cartesian matter or material substance. So property dualists are trivially committed to at least two Cartesian substances, but this needn't come as a surprise, and the real question is whether they're also committed to the existence of a non-physical Cartesian substance. Now, I don't think this can be shown by using the premises of the standard argument for property dualism alone, but it can be shown by a homologous line of reasoning, or nearly homologous, what I call the Barclayan argument. And here it is. According to this argument, the phenomenal facts about our world, the facts about consciousness, do not a priori entail the existence of physical entities. According to premise 2, if this is the case, then they do not metaphysically necessitate the existence of physical entities. Ergo, the aggregate of all phenomenal entities has independent existence or is a Cartesian substance. That follows because if the phenomenal entities, if all the experiences, roughly speaking, don't necessitate the existence of physical entities, then they could exist without them. There could be a phenomenal duplicate of our world with no physical entities. I call this a Barclayan argument because a phenomenal duplicate of our world with no physical entities looks a bit like the world as described by Bishop Barclay. Okay. Should we accept, or should the property dualist accept, that the phenomenal facts do not a priori entail the existence of physical entities? Premise 1. Well, I say it's hard to imagine how things could be otherwise, supposing there are mind-independent physical entities at all. After all, this surely follows from their mind independence. And I'd note that Chalmers, in his 1996 work, I should say he's now much more sympathetic to substance dualism than he was then. I'm talking about the 1996 Chalmers here. I'm not talking about the 2016 Chalmers. The former is continuing to be influential and relevant, so this is okay. The 1996 Chalmers explicitly endorses at page 75 something close to premise 1 here when he proposes that external world skepticism arises because the facts about the external world do not supervene logically on the facts about experience. So, should we accept, we should accept premise 1. Should we accept that if this is the case, then the phenomenal entities do not metaphysically necessitate the existence of physical entities? Premise 2. Well, although there are some complications here which I can't go into now, I think the obvious thought will prove true. And this is that anyone who accepts the second premise of the standard argument for property dualism ought to accept the second premise of this argument too. After all, it would be very surprising if the same inference worked in one direction but not in the other. So it seems to me that proponents of the standard argument for property dualism had better accept the Barclayan argument too. And this means they have to accept the existence of at least one non-physical Cartesian substance, albeit that that's just the aggregate of experiential entities. We haven't yet got a non-physical self, or a substantial self either. I now move on to the second step in my line of reasoning, and we're getting towards wine here. The simplest way to... So, what we need now is to get to a non-physical self, which is also a substance in its own right. The simplest way to do this, and I think there are a few, is what I call the solipsistic argument. And before I come to it, in order for the solipsistic argument to work, I need to add one substantive premise, which I should flag up. This is that I'm just going to assume here that for there to be a conscious experience, there must be a subject of that experience, a subject that undergoes it. This is the thesis putatively denied by Hume and certain Buddhist thinkers, although it's been argued convincingly that Hume doesn't actually think that, in my opinion, convincingly. And I just accept that anyone who took seriously the idea that there could be experience without an experiencer, no matter how minimal, someone who took seriously that idea wouldn't have to accept the solipsistic argument. On the other hand, I think it's far from clear that Hume or the Buddhist tradition really endorsed something quite so radical. And as Galen Strawson has pointed out, it's difficult to understand how anyone could, because by consciousness or conscious experience, we usually just mean these days what it is like subjectively for some subject. So it's very hard to understand what it could mean to take the subject out of that. You wouldn't have anything left. And anyway, as far as I'm aware, none of the leading property dualists, or few of them, as far as I'm aware, none of them, are proponents of this no-self view. And so it seems to me my target audience here ought to go along with me on this assumption. Now, if this premise is accepted, it seems that those who accept the argument for property dualism, the standard argument, are already committed to the existence of non-physical subjects. For given the Barclayan argument, the aggregate of phenomenal entities does not depend on or necessitate anything physical. But it does depend on, or it does necessitate, subjects of experience. And so, subjects of experience had better not be physical either. Now, there's some complexity that could be gone into there, but I think basically this line of reasoning works. The Barclayan argument plus the existence of subjects of experience at all gets us to non-physical subjects of experience. If that's right, then we're quite close to showing that property dualists ought to be accepting paradigmatic substance dualism. The only step that's left is to show that these non-physical subjects of experience are substances in their own right, that they are also Cartesian substances. Now, in order to do this, we can deploy what I call the solipsistic argument, which is again closely homologous to the standard argument for property dualism. Now, where the Barclayan argument rests on the a priori possibility of a Barclayan world, the solipsistic argument rests on the a priori possibility of a solipsistic world. And put in the first person, as Stephen Priest would recommend, it goes as follows. As follows. Facts about me and my experience do not a priori entail the existence of other subjects or their experience. If this is the case, then they do not metaphysically necessitate the existence of any subjects or their experience. Ergo, I, as a conscious subject, have independent existence, or am a Cartesian substance. There's some suppressed assumptions here. We're assuming that we've already shown as something that can exist without physical entities, the only other things I could depend on would be other subjects and their experiences, and we're just trying to show I don't depend on those, so I don't depend on anything else at all, apart from perhaps God or numbers. So, should the property dualist accept the first premise of the solipsistic argument? Well, I'd say it's highly counterintuitive that my mere existence a priori entails the existence of someone else. And presumably it's this fact that gives rise to skepticism about other minds, just as the first premise of the Barclayan argument gives rise to skepticism about the external world. And I think anyone who denied these premises would owe us a solid a priori argument against those kind of skeptical positions. I don't think there's such an argument. I think that would be far too easy, and you'd have misunderstood some fundamental features of our epistemic circumstance, which are very widely recognized. And I also think the lack of a priori entailment from one subject's experience or one subject's existence to another might underlie the mysterious notion of the unity of consciousness as well, or part thereof. This is the fact that, as William James puts it, the breaches between thoughts belonging to different minds are the most absolute breaches in nature. Should the property dualist accept that if my existence as a non-physical subject doesn't a priori entail the existence of any other subject or their experience, then there's no metaphysical necessitation from me to those other subjects? Well, once again, I think that it's going to be very hard to accept the second premise of the standard argument for property dualism if you're not going to accept the second premise of this argument, because it seems to be an instance of the same general principle. So, supposing this is correct, the property dualist needs to accept both the Barclayan argument and the solipsistic argument, which means they've got to accept that selves or subjects of experience are non-physical Cartesian substances, which is what I set out to prove. I'll conclude just by commenting on how much of a disaster this is. It's not obvious to me that it's a disaster at all. And this is because it's never been utterly clear what the advantage of property dualism over substance dualism is supposed to be in the first place, despite the significant popularity of the former and the continued widely held contempt for the latter. So it's interesting to pause briefly on this. The usual grounds for rejecting substance dualism are roughly that a non-physical entity couldn't act causally on a physical entity, whereas we know that mental phenomena do have physical effects. And works defending property dualism, like Chalmers and Kim, which I've referred to, frequently give versions of this problem as their grounds for rejecting substance dualism. Chalmers and Kim give two different versions, the former something about causal closure, the latter what's known as the pairing problem. Now, as it happens, I don't think there's a genuine or an insuperable problem for mind-body interaction on dualist views, but I'd add that if there is such a problem, it's just as great a problem for property dualism as it is for substance dualism. Property dualists are also positing non-physical entities, fundamentally new entities, and if these have to interact with the physical world on substance dualism, they'll have to on property dualism as well. And it's rather bizarre that Chalmers and Kim seem to accept this in the works I've referred to, because both of them endorse a form of non-interactionism in order to allow their property dualist views to get around this problem. If that's right, the standard interaction problem is no reason for preferring property dualism to substance dualism. It's also been suggested, although less prominently, Penelope Mackie says this at one point, that there's some sense in which property dualism is more ontologically parsimonious than substance dualism, that it involves less of a metaphysical commitment. Now, I've not heard a clear explanation of why this should be so, because whether we're positing substantive or substantial metaphysical, substantial non-physical selves or non-physical phenomenal properties, we're still positing fundamentally new features of the world. And insofar as that's the case, these views seem to have an equal lack of parsimony, leaving us to ask which best satisfies our theoretical needs. There is, however, one respect in which I think our result might cause legitimate worry to property dualists. It seems to me that there is a sense in which property dualism looks like it might integrate relatively easily with our wider contemporary picture of the natural world. As its proponents have tried to emphasize, positing non-physical mental properties in addition to physical is a bit like positing electromagnetic force in addition to gravitational force. It seems like an incremental addition to our ontology, not a radical shift or departure in our overall view of reality. Now, by contrast, I am somewhat sympathetic to the view, for a number of reasons, that positing substantial non-physical selves isn't going to fit so easily into our wider naturalistic worldview. There's a picture of Newton to represent our wider naturalistic worldview. I'm aware that we've moved on from Newtonianism in some respects, but as Stephen suggested earlier, it still dominates our thinking in other respects. Now, I'm not going to be able to address this question here, except to say that, as in all such cases, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. I think we might need substantial non-physical selves, and if we do, so much the worse for our contemporary naturalistic worldview. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. I think it's clear you've completely deboweled the aspirations of property dualists to reject Cartesianism.
Thank you. Good question.
We have time for a couple of questions, so the first one will be from Stephen Priest. I'll just bring over the mic.
Yeah. Suppose we accept that the Buddhists and Hume are wrong in advancing a no ownership or no self theory. Someone might say it still doesn't follow from this that the subject of experience is a Cartesian subject, and the ground they might advance is that the owner of experiences depends on the experiences, that there can't be any owners of experiences without the experiences.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on how you read Husserl.
Descartes might agree with that.
Well, he's ambiguous on this point.
Yeah.
As a matter of biography or history. But Husserl seems to think that the transcendental ego, the transcendentale Ich, is the subject of experience. There's got to be an Ich pole for the experiences which, by and large, exhibit intentionality. There are some exceptions, moods and sensations, depending on how you read Husserl. Now, what do you say about that sort of position, where it's thought that the ownership is catered for, but not with the existence of a Cartesian substance?
Well,
why are they wrong, people who... And you have to show they're wrong in order for your conclusion to go through.
Yeah, well, I think the solipsistic argument shows they're wrong. I think so long as they're believing in non-physical entities at all, because they think we can derive an absence of metaphysical necessitation from an absence of a priori entailment, then by positing non-physical experiences which have subjects of any kind at all, and accepting that my existence and my experience doesn't a priori entail that of anyone else's, they're positing a subject which satisfies Descartes' criterion for being a substance. So you've got a non-physical Cartesian substance as your subject.
I mean, it sounds as though, in a sense, this Husserlian subject, which comes and goes, is part of the aggregate of mentality, which is the true Cartesian substance here. Is that right?
I don't follow. Right? Could you clarify?
Well, Husserl himself has a methodological device called epoche, where you suspend on methodological grounds belief in the existence of the external world, and you're the result is a phenomenological residue. Roughly speaking, the world is reduced to the phenomenological appearance of the world, but he has the subject as coming and going, as sometimes appearing and sometimes not. So, I mean, it sounds as though your conclusion is rather similar, as though that, but you draw an ontological conclusion from it, which Husserl does not. Husserl just thinks this is a methodological device. I mean, something you can do, a kind of methodological
I think
doubting.
Husserl, as far as I know, didn't put forward a version of the standard argument for property dualism.
No.
But I say that if he had, then he had better accept Cartesian substance dualism as well. But this only works on people who accept that argument. It might not work on Husserl.
Okay, thanks, very good.
One more question from Nick Barclay.
Thanks, Ralph. Very interesting. Could we see the Barclayan argument again, please?
No, I went past it swiftly for a reason. I knew I shouldn't have made a PowerPoint.
Thanks very much. So one thing that kind of two really points that hopefully one will lead into the other. So at the end you said, well, property dualism and substance dualism might be on all fours with regard to parsimony. And I wonder if that someone might push back against that by saying, well, if you've got non-physical substances, they're going to have non-physical properties as well. So on property dualism, you just allow in non-physical properties, but on substance dualism, you're allowing in non-physical properties and non-physical substances. So there's a discrepancy there. One is more parsimonious than the other.
That only entails that substance dualism can't be less parsimonious than property dualism. It doesn't entail that it's more parsimonious than it shows that substance dualism can't be any more parsimonious than property dualism. It doesn't show that it is any less parsimonious than property dualism. Right? So what you're saying is that substance dualism entails property dualism.
Yeah.
So it follows a fortiori that any commitment to substance dualism is going to be as unparsimonious as a commitment to property dualism, or more so.
Yes.
And I'm just saying we don't have any reason to justify taking the view that it's the second disjunct rather than the former.
Right. So
they could still be equally lacking in parsimony, even if one entails the other.
Right. Sorry, I'm maybe a bit confused there. So the idea is that substance dualism, you get non-physical substances and non-physical properties. Property dualism, you just get non-physical properties, but what, you might have non-physical substances floating around as well?
No, it's just that I don't see why it's any worse to posit a non-physical property than to posit a non-physical substance. You're still...
So if you're positing something non-physical, which is a property...
There's a sense in which you might say, here there's two extra things and here there's only one.
Yeah, because a property is a different type of thing from a substance, is what I'm thinking. But maybe you're saying, well, look, the difficult bit is the non-physicality coming into a world. And it doesn't matter if that attaches to properties or substances. You've got the weird bit.
I mean, if there were a clear way of showing what the difference is between a property and a substance, we're remembering that we mean a property instance here, then that might be a good response. However, the only difference we've got at the moment is that substances have independent existence. Now, I don't think that makes them less parsimonious. So what is it about substances that distinguishes them from properties other than that's going to mean it's an extra kind of thing which we should be worried about?
Okay, so that might help a little bit with my question I have got about premise one then. Phenomenal facts about our world do not a priori entail the existence of physical entities.
Yeah.
So on property dualism, you've got some property instances. So what I'm thinking is that maybe the property dualist is going to say, look, you can't have uninstantiated property instances. And property instances are always going to be instantiated in some kind of substance or other. It's got to be a non-physical substance or a physical substance. That just exhausts the options. Since I don't believe in non-physical substance for the arguments I give against why I'm not a substance dualist, whatever it is, I just have to say, look, yeah, they do a priori entail the existence of physical entities because I've given my arguments for why they don't exist.
Yeah. I'd say two things about that. The first thing I'd say is that for it to work as a reply, they'd need all of their arguments against substance dualism to be a priori, whereas as far as I'm aware, they usually, the most standard one is the causal closure thing.
Yeah.
I've said it applies to both, but it also relies on empirical information.
Yeah.
And the other response would be that I don't think they could assume that properties have to be instantiated in a substance when by substance we mean Cartesian substance, something with something with independent existence. They might say they have to be instantiated, that's fine, and maybe they think that they need to be instantiated in a particular or something like that. But I don't see why properties have to be instantiated in something with independent existence.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't seem a priori to me that that's true.
Thanks, that's great.
Although it's the first time I've ever thought about it.
Well, you did a remarkable job for the first. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for. Let's thank Ralph once again for an excellent presentation.